Rider. Book 7. Snakehead. Chapter 7. Father and Son. The next morning, Alex ate the best breakfast of his life. He had a feeling he was going to need it. The hotel offered a hot and cold buffet that included just about every cuisine: French, English, Thai, Vietnamese, with dishes ranging from eggs and bacon to stir-fried noodles. Ash joined him but spoke little. He seemed to be in deep thought. And Alice wondered if he was already having reservations about what lay ahead. "You had enough?" he asked as Alex finished his second croissant. Alice nodded. "Then let's go up to your room. Miss Webber will be here soon. We'll wait for her there." Alex had no idea who Miss Webber was, and it didn't seem that Alice wanted to tell him. The two of them went back up to the 19th floor. Ash hung the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door and pointed Alex to a seat next to the window. He sat down opposite. "Okay," he began. "Let me tell you how this works. 2 weeks ago, working with Pakistani authorities, ASIS managed to pick up a father and a son heading into India on their way here. We interrogated them and discovered they'd paid the Snakehead $4,000 American dollars to smuggle them into Australia. Originally, we were just going to send them back, but now we've decided to use them. The father's called Karen, the son is Abdul. Get used to the names, Alex, because from now on, that's you and me. Karen and Abdul Hassan were taking their place, which means staying here in Bangkok. They were given an address and told to wait there until they were contacted by a man called Sukit. Who's he? It took us a while to find out, but it turns out we're talking about Mr. Anand Sukit. He works for Major Yu, one of his lieutenants. You might say, very high up, very dangerous. It means we're one step down the pipeline, Alex. We're on our way. So we wait for him to get in touch. Exactly. What about the real Abdul? Alex asked. He wondered how he could pretend to be someone he had never met. You don't need to know much about him or his father. The two of them are Hazaras, a minority group with Afghanistan. The Hazaras have been persecuted for centuries. They get the worst education and the poorest jobs. In fact, most people think of them as hardly better than animals. Kafir. That's the word they use for them. It means infidel. And in Afghanistan, it's the worst 4-letter word you could call anyone. So where do they get their money? Alex asked. They had a business in Mazar-e Sharif, which they managed to sell just before it was taken from them. They hid out in Hindu Kush until they made contact with a local agent for the Snakehead, paid the money and began their journey south. I don't suppose I look anything like an Afghan. And I said, what do these Hazara people look like? Most of them are Asian, Mongol or Chinese, but not at all. In fact, a lot of them managed to survive in Afghanistan precisely because they didn't look too Eastern. Anyway, you don't need to worry. Miss Webber will take care of that. How about language? You won't talk. Ever. You're going to pretend to be a simpleton? Just stare into the corner and keep your mouth shut. Try and look scared, as if I'm about to beat you. Maybe I will from time to time, just to make us look authentic. Alex wasn't sure if Ash was being serious or not. I speak Dari, Ash went on. That's the majority language in Afghanistan, and it's the language the Snakehead will use. I speak a few words of Hazaragi too, but we shouldn't need them. Just remember, never open your mouth. If you do, you'll kill us both. Ash stood up. While he had been talking, he had been grim, almost hostile, but now he turned to Alex with something close to desperation in his dark brown eyes. Alex, he paused, scratching his beard. Are you sure you want to do this? SAS has got nothing to do with you. People smuggling and all the rest of it. You should be at school. Why don't you just go home? It's a bit late now. Alex agreed. Alex said, I agreed, and I want you to tell me about my dad. Is that the main reason you agreed to this? It's the only reason. I don't think I could forgive myself if anything happened to you. I'd be dead if it wasn't for your father. That's the truth of it. I looked away as if trying to avoid the memory. One day I'll tell you about it. Malta and what happened after Yasan Gregorovich had finished with me, but I'll tell you this right now. John wouldn't thank me for getting you into trouble. So if you'll take my advice, you'll call Brooke, tell him you've changed your mind and get out now. I'm staying, Alex said, but thanks anyway. In fact, what Ash had just said, the mention of Yasen Gregorovich had only made Alex determined to learn more. Suddenly things were beginning to come together. Alex knew that his father, John Ryder, had pretended to be an enemy agent working for Scorpia, and when MI6 wanted him back, they had arranged for him to be captured. That had been in Malta. It had all been set up, and Yasen Gregorovich had been there. Yasen was an international assassin, and Alex had met him 14 years later. First, when he was working for Horowitz. The second time inside the Empire of the May and Cray. Yasen was dead now, but it seemed that he was still destined to be part of Alex's life. Ash had met him in Malta, and whatever had happened on that island was part of the story that Alex wanted to know. You're sure? Ash asked him one last time. I'm sure, Alex said. Very well. Ash nodded gravely. Then I'd better teach you this. But Azar Tariki Rashani asked. It's an old Afghan proverb, and there may come a time when you need to remember it. After every darkness, there is light. I hope it will be true for you. There was a knock at the door. Ash went over and opened it, and a short, rather dumpy woman walked in, carrying a suitcase. She could have been a retired matron, or perhaps a very old-fashioned school teacher. She was wearing an old-fashioned She was wearing an olive green two-piece suit and heavy stockings that only emphasized the fact that she had very shapeless legs. Her hair hung loose with no particle colour or style. Her face could have been made of putty. She was wearing no makeup. There was a single brooch, a silver daisy pinned to her lapel. How are you doing, Ash? She smiled as she came in, and that, along with her broad, sturdy accent, seemed to bring her to life. "Good to see you, Claudie," Ash replied. He closed the door. "This is Miss Webber, Alex," he explained. "She works for ASIS, a specialist in disguise. Her name is Chloe, but we call her Claudie. We think it suits her better. Claudie Webber. Meet Alex Ryder." The woman stumped over to Alex and examined him. She muttered disapprovingly. "Mr. Hook must need his head examined if he thinks we're going to get away with this one. But I'll see what I can do." "See the suitcase onto the bed. Let's have all the clothes off you, boy. T-shirt, boxers, those lot. The first thing we're going to start with is your skin." "Wait a minute," Alice began. "For heaven's sake!" the woman exploded. "You think I'm going to see anything I haven't seen before?" She turned to Ash, who was watching. "It's the same for you, Ash. I don't know what you're grinning about, but you may look a bit like an Afghan than him. But I'm going to need all your clothes too." She unzipped the suitcase and took out half a dozen plastic bottles filled with various dark liquids. Next came a hairbrush, a vanity bag, and several tubes that might have contained toothpastes. The rest of the case was packed with clothes that looked and smelled as if they had come off a skip. "The clothes are all from Oxfam," she explained, "donated in England and picked up in the market in Mazar-e-Sharif. I'll give you 2 sets each, which is all you'll need. You'll wear them day and night. Ash, go on about." She unscrewed one of the bottles. The smell, seaweed, and white spirit reached Alex even on the other side of the room. "Cold water. Cold water," she added sharply. In the end, she let Alex take a bath on his own. She had mixed 2 bottles of brown dye with half a bath of cold water. Alex was instructed to lie in it for 10 minutes, submerging both his face and his hair. He was shivering by the time he was allowed out, and he didn't dare look in the mirror as he dried himself, but he noticed that the hotel towels looked as if they'd been dragged through a sewer. He pulled on a pair of ragged, shapeless boxers and came out. "That's better," Miss Webber muttered. She noticed a raw scar just above his heart. It was where Alex had been shot and nearly killed by a sniper following his encounter with Scorpia. "That might be useful too," she added. "A lot of Afghan boys have bullet wounds. Together the 2 of you make quite the pair." Ice didn't know what she meant. He glanced at Ash and then he understood. Ash was just putting on a loose, short-sleeved shirt, and for a moment his chest and stomach were exposed. He too had a scar, but it was much worse than Alex's. A distinct line of white, dead skin that snaked across his belly and down below the waistline of his trousers. Ash turned away, buttoning up the shirt, but he was too late. Alex had seen the terrible injury. It was a stab wound. He was sure of that. He wondered who had been holding the knife. "Come and sit down, Alex," Miss Webber said. She had produced a tarpaulin which she had spread underneath the chair. "Let me deal with your hair." Alex did as he was told, and for the next few minutes he had only the click of scissors and watched as uneven clumps of his hair tumbled to the floor. From the way she worked, he doubted that Miss Webber had received her training in a London salon. A sheep shearing farm was more likely. When she had finished cutting, she opened one of the tubes and smeared a thick, greasy ointment over his head. Finally, she stepped back. He looks great, Ash said. The teeth still need work. They'd give him away in a minute. There was another tube of paste for his teeth. She rubbed it in using her finger. Lastly, she produced 2 small plastic caps. They were both the size of a tooth, but one was grey and one was black. I'm going to glue these in, Miss Webber warned him. Alice opened his mouth and allowed her to fix the fake teeth into place. He grimaced. His mouth no longer felt like his own. You'll notice them for a day or two, but then you'll forget them, she said. She stepped back. There, I'm all done. Why don't you get the rest and take a look at yourself? Claudia, you're damn good, Ash muttered. And he put on a faded red t-shirt and a pair of jeans, both of them dirty and full of holes. Then he went into the bathroom and stood in front of the full-length mirror. He gasped. The boy he was looking at certainly wasn't him. He was olive-skinned, with hair that was short, dark brown, and matted in thick strands. Somehow the clothes made him look thinner than he really was. He opened his mouth and saw that 2 of his teeth seemed to have rotted, and the rest were ugly and discoloured. Miss Webber came in behind him. You won't need to worry about the skin colour for 2 weeks, he said. Not unless you take a bath. And I don't think you'll be doing that. You'll have to check on the hair and eat every 5 or 6 days. I'll make sure Ash has plenty of supplies. It's amazing, I said. He was standing at the door. I've got some trainers for you, Miss Webber added. You don't need socks. I doubt a refugee boy would wear any. She went back into the bedroom and produced a pair of trainers that were stained and torn. Alex tried to slip them on. They're too small, he said. Miss Webber found. I can cut a hole for your toes. No, I can't wear them. She scowled at him, but even she could see that the trainers were far too small. All right, she nodded. You can't hang on too long. Just give me a minute. She dug around in the suitcase and produced a razor, some old paint, and another bottle of some sort of chemical. 2 minutes later, Alex's own trainers looked as if they had been thrown away 10 years before. As he slipped them on, she set to work on Ash. He too had completely changed. He didn't need to dye his skin, and his beard would have suited a Hazara tribesman, but his hair had to be hacked around, and he needed new clothes as well. It was strange. By the time she had finished, it was strange. By the time she had finished, Alex and Ash really could have been father and son. Poverty had brought them closer together. Miss Webber packed all the clothes that Alex and Ash had been wearing into her suitcase. She zipped her bag shut and straightened up. She jabbed a finger in Ash's direction. You look after Alex, she commanded. I've already had worked with Mr. Brook, sending a boy this age into the field. I don't think it's right. Just so you make sure he comes back in one piece. I'll look after him, Ash promised. You'd better take care, Alex. And with that, she was gone. Ash turned to Alex. How are you feeling? Grimy. It's going to get worse. Are you ready? It's time we left. Alex moved towards the door. We'll take the service lift, Alex said, and we'll find the way back out. If anyone sees us looking like this in Peninsula Hotel, we'll be arrested. The driver who had met Alex at the airport was waiting for them outside the hotel, and he took them over the river and then upstream towards Chinatown, and felt the air conditioning blowing cold against his skin, and knew that it was a luxury he wasn't going to enjoy again for a while. The car dropped them off at a corner, and at once the heat, the grime and the noise of the city hit him. He was sweating before the door even closed. Ash dragged a small battered case out of the boot, and that was it. Suddenly they were on their own. Bangkok's Chinatown was like nowhere Alex had ever been before. When he looked up, it seemed to have no sky. All the lights had been blocked out by billboards, banners, electric cables, and neon signs. Tom Yum King Kong Restaurant, Dai Message Seng Hong Dental Clinic. Great smile start here. The pavements were equally cluttered, every inch of them taken up by stalls spilling food and cheap clothes and electronics into the street. There were people everywhere, hundreds of them, weaving their way between the traffic, which seemed frozen in an endless, diesel-infested jam. This way, Ash muttered, keeping his voice low. From now on, whenever he spoke in English, he would make sure he wasn't overheard. They pushed their way into the chaos, and the next few minutes Alex had passed vegetables that he had never seen before, and meats he hoped he would never see again. Hearts and lungs bulbing in green soup, and brown intestines spilling out of their cauldrons as if trying to escape. Every centre of the planet seemed to be mixed together. Meat, fish, and rubble and sweat. Every step brought another smell. They walked for about 10 minutes until they came to an opening between the restaurant with a few plastic tables and a single glass counter, displaying plastic replicas of the food. Of the food it served, and a paintworks. Here at last was an escape from the main road. A soiled, narrow alleyway led down between two blocks of flats piled up on top of one another, as if thrown there at random. There was a miniature altar at the entrance that incense adding no small to Alex's collection. Further along, 2 cars had been parked next to a dozen crates of empty Pepsi bottles, a pile of old gas canisters, and a row of tables and chairs. A Chinese woman was sitting cross-legged in the gutter, fixing ribbons to baskets of exotic fruit. Alice remembered the complimentary fruit basket in his hotel room. Maybe this was where it had come from. "This is the place," Ash said. It was the address that Karim Hassan and his son had been given by a snakehead. This is where they were expected to stay. All the flats opened directly onto the alleyways, and Alice could see straight in. There were no doors or curtains. In one front room, a Chinese man sat smoking at a table, dressed in shorts and glasses, his huge stomach bulging over his knees. In another, a whole family were eating lunch, crouching on the floor with chopsticks They came to a room that looked derelict but was occupied. An old woman was standing beside a stove. Ash signalled to Alex to wait. They went over and spoke to her, relying on sign language as much as words, and waving a sheet of paper in front of her face. She understood and pointed to a staircase. At the back, Ash grunted something in dairy, and pretending to understand, Alex hurried forward. Stairs were made of cement with pools of murky water on at least half of them. Alex followed Ash to the third floor and single door with no handle. Ash pushed it open. On the other side was a bare room with a metal bed, a spare mattress on the floor, a sink, a toilet, and a grimy window. There was no carpet and no light. As Alex walked in, the biggest cockroach he had ever seen climbed over the side of the bed and scattered across the wall. "This is it," Alex muttered. "This is it," Ash said. Outside in the alleyway, the man who had followed them all the way from the hotel made note of the building. As he turned away, he took out a mobile and dialed a number. By the time he had been connected, he had disappeared into the crowd. Chapter 8. First Contact. "Suppose they don't come," Alex said. "They'll come. How much longer do you think we're going to have to wait?" They've been living in Chinatown for nearly 3 days, and Alex was feeling hot, frustrated and bored. Ash wouldn't let him have a newspaper or a book in English. There was always the chance that he might be caught reading it by someone entering the room. Nor was he able to see very much of Bangkok. There was no way of knowing where the Snakehead might show up, and they couldn't risk being out. But Alex had been allowed to spend a couple of hours early each morning wandering on his own through the streets. It amused him that nobody treated him like a tourist. Indeed, tourists stepped aside to avoid him. Miss Webber had done her job well. He looked like a street urchin from somewhere far away. And after more than 50 hours without a shower or bath, without even changing his clothes, he could imagine he could be smelled long before he could be seen. Slowly he managed to get to grips with the city, the way the shops and the houses, the pavement and the streets all tumbled into each other, the clammy heat, the never-ending noise and movement. There seemed to be a surprise round every corner, a cripple with the legs scuttling past on his hands like a giant spider, a temple sprouting out of nowhere like an exotic flower, bald-headed monks in their bright orange robes moving in a crowd. He also learnt a little more about Ash. Ash slept badly. He had given Alex the bed and taken the mattress for himself. But sometimes in the night he would begin muttering and then jerk awake. He would clasp his hands to his stomach, and Alex knew that he was remembering the time he had been stabbed, that it was hurting him even now. "Why did you become a spy?" Alex asked one morning. "It seemed like a good idea at the time." Ash growled. He hated being asked questions and seldom gave straightforward answers. That day he was in a better mood. "I approached while I was in the army, but by Alan Blunt. No, he was there when I joined. But he wasn't in the top spot. I was recruited a short while after your dad. I'll tell you why he joined, if you like." "Why?" "He was a patriot," Ash Gumont. "He really thought he had a duty to serve the Queen and country. Don't you?" "I did. Once." "So what happened? What made you change your mind?" "It was a long time ago." Ash had a way of cutting off a conversation if he didn't want to say more. Alex had come to learn that when when that had happened. There was no point. There was no point. There was no point trying to go on. Ash could wrap silence around him like a coat. It was infuriating, but he knew he would just have to wait. Ash would talk in his own time. Then on the fourth day, the Snakehead came. Alex had got back with food from the local market when he heard the stamp of feet on the concrete steps. Ash threw a look of warning and swung himself off the bed. Just as the door crashed open, one of the ugliest men Alex had ever seen walked into the room. He was short, wearing a suit that looked as if it had shrunk in the wash to fit him. He was bald and unshaven so that both the top and the bottom of his head were covered in a thin black stubble. On the other hand, he didn't seem to have any eyebrows, as if his skin were too thick and pock-marked to grow. Though his mouth was impossibly wide, like an open wound, with as many gaps as teeth. Worst of all, he had no ears. Alex could see the discoloured lumps of flesh that remained. The rest had at some time been cut off. This had to be Nantucket. There was a second man with him, dressed in a white t-shirt and jeans, carrying a camera, a clunky wooden box that could have come out of an antique shop. A third man followed. He looked similar to Bash, presumably an Afghan, brought along to translate. Alex had quickly sat down in the corner. He glanced at the three men, but tried not to show too much interest, as if he didn't want to be noticed. Sugit snapped a few words at the translator, who then spoke to Ash. Ash replied in Derry, and a three-way conversation began. As it continued, Alex noticed Sugit examining him. The Snakehead lieutenant had tiny pupils which moved ceaselessly, darting left and right. The cameraman had started his work, and Alex sat still as several shots were taken of him. Then it was Ash's turn. He had already explained to Alex what sort of papers would be prepared. Passports, possibly with visas for Indonesia, a police arrest form for Ash, a hospital report showing that he had been injured during questioning, perhaps an old membership card for the Communist Party. All these things would help them get refugee status once they arrived in Australia. The photograph had finished, but the discussion went on. Alex became aware that something was wrong. Sugit nodded in his direction a couple of times. He seemed to be making some sort of demand. Ash was arguing and he looked unhappy. Alex heard his name, Abdul, mentioned several times. Then suddenly Alex Sugit walked over to him. He was sweating and his skin smelled of garlic. Without warning, he reached down and dragged Alex to his feet. Ash stood up and shouted something. Alex couldn't quite understand a word that was being said, but he did what Ash had told him, and said with unfocused eyes, as if he were a simpleton. Sugit slapped him twice on each side on his face. Alex cried out. It wasn't just the pain, it was casual violence, the shock of what had happened. Ash let loose a torrent of words. He seemed to be pleading. Sugit spoke one last time. Ash nodded. Whatever had been demanded, he'd agreed. The three men turned and left the room. Alex waited until he was sure they had gone. His cheeks were stinging. I take it that was Anand Sugit, he muttered. That was him. What happened to his ears? A gang fight 5 years ago. Maybe I should have mentioned it to you before. Someone cut them off. He's lucky he doesn't need glasses. Alex rubbed the side of his face with a grimy hand. So what was all that about, he said. Yes. I don't know. I don't understand. Ash was deep in thought. They're getting the papers for us. They'll be ready this evening. That's good. But why did he hit me? He made a demand. I refused. So he got angry and took it out on you. I'm sorry, Alex. Ash ran a hand through his curly dark hair. He did look shaken by what had just taken place. I didn't want him to hurt you, but there was nothing I could do. What did he want? I sighed. Sick insists that you collected the papers? Not me. He just wants you. Why? He didn't say. He told me they'd pick you up at Pat Pong at 7 o'clock this evening. You've got to be on your own. If you're not there, you'll forget it. The deal's off. Ash fell silent. He had lost control of the situation and he knew it. Alex wasn't sure how to respond. His first encounter with the snake had been short and unpleasant. The question was, why do they want him? What do they want with him? Had they seen through his disguise? If he turned up at this place, Pat Pong, they could bundle him into a car and he might never be seen again. They wanted to kill you. They could have done it here now, I said. It was as if he'd read Alex's thoughts. They could have killed both of us. Do you think I should go? I can't make that a decision, Alex. That's up to you. But if he didn't go, there would be no forged papers. No way for us to find out where they were being manufactured. Nor would the two of them be able to continue down the pipeline. The mission would be over before it had even begun. And Alex would have learned nothing from Ash. Nothing about his father, about Malta, about Yasan Grigorovich. It was a risk, but it was one worth taking. I'll do it, Alex said. Pat Pong showed Alex another side of Bangkok, and no one that he wanted to see. It was a tangle of bars and striped clubs where backpackers and businessmen gathered to drink the night away. Through the doorways, he glimpsed half-naked dancers. He glanced half-naked dancers rhything in time to Western pop music. Fat men in floral shirts strolled past with Thai girlfriends. The neon lights flickered and the music pounded out, and the air was thick with the smell of alcohol and cheap perfume. It was the last place on earth that a 14-year-old English boy would want to find himself, and Alex was feeling distinctly uncomfortable standing at the entrance to the main square. But he'd only been there a few times. Only been there a few minutes when a beaten up black Citroen pulled over with 2 men inside. He recognized one of them. The man in the passenger seat had been carrying the camera and taking pictures of him and Ash. This was it. He had come to Thailand to investigate the Snakehead. Now he was delivering himself to them with no weapons, no gadgets, nothing to help him if things went wrong. But they simply go down over the papers as promised. Somehow he doubted it. But it was too late for second thoughts. He climbed into the back of the car. The seat was plastic and it was torn. Furry dice swung beneath the driver's mirror. Nobody spoke to him, but then, of course, they didn't know his language. Ashes warned him not to say anything. No matter what happened, one word of English would mean an immediate death. death sentence for both of them. He would pretend he was simple, that he understood nothing at all. If things got out of hand, he would try to break away. The Citroën joined the sluggish flow of traffic. Suddenly they were surrounded by cars, lorries, buses and tuk-tuks. As always, everyone was hooting at everyone else. The heat of the evening only intensified the noise and the smell of exhaust fumes that hung thick in the air. They drove for about 30 minutes. It was dark and Alex had no idea in which direction they were heading. He tried to pick out a few landmarks: a neon sign, a skyscraper with a strange gold dome on the roof, a hotel. Part of his job was to find out as much about the Snakehead as he could. And the following day he might have to show Ash exactly where he'd been taken. The car turned off the main road and suddenly they were travelling down a narrow alleyway. Between two high walls, Alex was liking this less and less. He had the feeling that he was delivering himself into some sort of trap. Sukkot had said he would hand over the papers, but Alex didn't believe him. There had to be another reason for all this. And then they broke out and he saw the river in front of him, the water black and empty, but for a single rice barge making its way home. In the far distance, a tower block that he recognized caught his eye. It was the Peninsula Hotel, where he had first spent his first night in Bangkok. It was less than half a mile upstream, but it might as well have belonged to a different world. The car slowed down. They had come right to the river's edge. The driver turned off the engine and they got out. The smell of sewage, that was what hit him first. Thick, sweet and heavy. The surface of the water was covered with a layer of rotten vegetables and rubbish that rocked back and forth with the current like of living carpet. One of the men pushed him hard in the small of his back, and Alex made his way over to the broken down jetty, where a boat was waiting to ferry them across to another hard-faced man, the Thai man at the rudder. Alex climbed in, the other men followed. They set off. The moon had risen, and out in the open everything was suddenly bright. Ahead of him, Alex could see their destination. There was a long 3-story building with a green painted sign advertising it to any passing river traffic. Chada Trading Company. Alex didn't like the look of it one bit. The building was on the very edge of the river, half falling into it, propped up to a series of concrete posts that held it about 2 meters above the water. It was made of wood and corrugated iron, a slanting, leaning assembly of roofs, verandas, balconies, and walkways that looked as if it had been hammered together by a child. It seemed to have fewer doors and fewer windows. As they drew closer, Alex heard the sound. A low shouting that suddenly rose up like the noise of a crowd at a football match. It was coming from inside. The boat arrived. A ladder led up to a landing platform, and once again, Alex felt a fist jabbing into his lower back. It seemed to be the only way these people knew how to communicate. Excuse me. He got unsteadily to his feet and grabbed the ladder. As he did so, he heard a splash and saw a streak of movement out of the corner. Something was living in the dark space underneath the building. There was another wall from inside, and the chime of a bell. How had he got himself into this? Alex gritted his teeth and climbed up. He went through a door and found himself in a narrow corridor that sloped down with doorways on each side. Naked bulbs dangling at intervals, throwing out a damp yellow light. The whole place smelled of the river. Halfway down they stopped at one of the doors, which was thrown open to reveal a room that was like a cell. A couple of meters square, with a tiny bed window, a bench, and a table. There was a pair of brightly coloured shorts lying on the bench. Cameraman, I didn't know his name, picked up the shorts. Tracy picked up the shorts and spat out a sentence in Thai. This time the meaning was clear. The door slammed shut. There was another wall from somewhere nearby. Sound echoing outwards. Alex picked up the shorts. They were made of silk, recently laundered. There were still dark spots embedded in the material. Old blood-stains. Alex clamped down the rising sense of fear. He looked at the window. There was no way he was going to be able to climb out. He had no doubt the men were standing guard on the other side of the door. He had the wind of a mosquito and slapped it against the side of his head. He began to undress. 10 minutes later, they led him further along the corridor to a flight of steps that seemed to have collapsed in on itself like a house of cards. Alex was now wearing the shorts and nothing else. They started high on his body, above the waist, and came down to his knees. There was a kind of warmth or a boxing or wrestling match. Which of them was it going to be? Or was he being led towards something worse than either? He could hear music playing, the crackle of a loudspeaker and a stream of words, amplified all in Thai. Laughter, the soft babble of many people talking. At last, he emerged into a scene that was like nothing he had ever experienced before, and something he would never forget. It was an arena, circular in shape, with dozens of narrow pillars holding up the ceiling, a raised boxing ring in the middle and wooden seating slanting up around the sides. It was lit by neon strips that dangled on chains, and there were 20 or 30 fans turning slowly, trying to redistribute the hot, sticky air. Thai music was blaring out of speakers, and bizarrely, there were all television sets facing outwards, each one showing a different program. The ring itself was surrounded by a wire fence, which had been built to keep either the players in or the audience out. There must have been about 400 people in the room. 400 is a lot. There must have been 400 people in the room. Chattering excitedly among themselves as they swapped bright yellow sweeps of paper. Alex had read somewhere that betting was illegal in Thailand, but he recognised at once what was going on here. He had arrived just at the end of a flight. He arrived just at the end of a fight. A young man was being dragged feet first across the ring, his arms splayed out, his shoulders painting a red streak along the canvas. As he was hauled away, and the members of the audience who had bet on his opponent were collecting their winnings. Alex was at the very back of the arena. As he arrived, another man dressed like him in shorts was led down to the ring, his entire body taut with fear. Seeing him, the audience laughed and applauded. More yellow betting slips changed hands. Someone put a hand on Alex's shoulder and pushed him down onto a plastic seat. There was a crack in the floor, and he caught a glimpse of silver. The river was lapping at the concrete posts underneath him. He was sweating, and the mosquitoes had picked up his scent. He could hear them right inside his ear. His skin crawled as he was bitten again and again. The new challenger had passed through the audience and reached the wire fence. Someone had placed a string of flowers around his neck, and he looked as if he were about to be sacrificed. It occurred to Alex that, in a sense, he was. Two burly Sidemen led him through an opening in the fence and helped him climb into the ring. They forced him to bow into the audience. Then, in the far corner, the champion appeared. He wasn't big, but he imitated power and speed. Alex could see every single muscle in his body. They were locked together like metal plates, and he didn't have a single spare ounce of fat. His hair, very black, was cut short. His eyes were black too. He had a boy's face, completely smooth, but Alex guessed he was in his mid-20s. His name, Sathorn, was written in white letters on his shorts. He bowed to the audience and danced on his feet, raising his fists to acknowledge their applause. The challenger awaited his fate. The flower garland had been removed, and the other men had left. The ring. The music stopped. A bell rang. At once Alex understood what he was seeing. He had been expected the worst, and this was it. Muay Thai, also known as the science of 8 limbs, one of the most aggressive and dangerous martial arts in the world. Alex had learned karate, but he knew that it was a world far apart from Muay Thai, which permitted strikes by the fists, elbows, knees and feet with no fewer than 24 targets. From the top by the top of his head to the rear calf on your opponent, and this was dirty, illegal version. Neither of the fighters had hand wraps, shin pads, or abdomen protectors. The fight would continue until one of them was carried out unconscious or worse. Alex watched the first round with a mixture of fascination and horror, knowing that he was going to be next. The fight had begun, with both men weaving around, weighing up each other's weakness. Sathorn had struck out a few times, first with a right side elbow attack, then twisting his body round in a fast knee strike. But the challenger was faster than he looked, dodging both blows and even trying a counter kick, slicing his left foot into the air and missing Sathorn's neck by centimetres. A move that sparked a roar of excitement in the crowd. But then, at the end of the first round, he made his fatal mistake. He had allowed his guard to drop as if waiting for the bell. Suddenly, Sathorn lashed out a rear leg push kick that slammed into the other man's chest, winding him and almost throwing him off his feet. It was only the chime of the bell a second later that saved him. He sagged into the corner where someone forced a bottle of water between his lips and flanelled down his face, but he was barely conscious. The next round wouldn't last long. In the brief interval, more music blasted out of the yellow speakers, out of the speakers, and the televisions flickered back on. Yellow slips were exchanged, and Alex noticed people gesturing wildly, angrily, tapping their watches. He was feeling sick. He realized that the spectators weren't betting on who was going to win the fight. With Sathorn in the ring, there could be no doubt of that. They were betting on how long the fighter could last against him. The bell rang for the next round, and as expected, it was all over very quickly. The challenger moved forward, as if he knew he was walking to his execution. Sir Thorn examined him with a cruel smile, then finished the fight in the most vicious way he could. A kick to the stomach, followed by a second, much harder kick straight to the face. A great flow of blood erupted into the ring. The audience howled. The challenger crashed down on his back and lay still. Sir Thorn danced around him and waving his fists in triumph. The cleaners climbed into the ring to clear away the mess. And now it was Alex's turn. He was suddenly aware of a man leaning over him, a weird, stretched out face like a reflection in a fairground mirror. It was Nantucket, the Snakehead lieutenant, and spoke to him first in Thai, then in another language. Once again, Alex smelled the stale scent of garlic. Snakehead paused. Alex stared straight ahead as if he hadn't heard what had just been said. Snakehead leaned forward. He said something in bad French. Then he repeated it in English. "You fight or I kill you." Alex had to force himself to pretend that he hadn't understood. The man couldn't possibly have known who he was or where he came from. He was simply saying the same thing in as many languages as possible. And finally, he used the most effective language of all, grabbing Alex by the hair and pulling him out of his seat, and then propelling him down the aisle towards the ring. As he walked down between the audience, Alex felt himself being examined and evaluated on every side. Once again, the yellow markers were being handed out, and he could imagine the bets being placed. Being 15 seconds, 20 seconds, it was obvious that this 4G boy wouldn't last long. His heart was pounding. He could actually see the movement in his naked chest. Why had he been chosen for this? Why not Ash? He could only assume that these people got a sick satisfaction out of ringing the changes. During the course of the evening, they had seen a number of men beaten up. Now they were going to watch the same thing happen to a teenager. He passed through the opening in the fence. The 2 seconds were waiting for him, grinning and offering to help him up into the ring. One of them was carrying a garland of flowers put around his neck. Alex already made up his mind about that. As their hands reached towards him, he struck out at them, drawing laughter and jeers from the crowd. But he wasn't going to be touched by them, and nor was he going to parade in their flowers. He poured himself into the ring just as 2 cleaners climbed out, lowering themselves between the ropes. They took with them the bloody rags that they had used to clean the canvas floor. Sir Thorn was waiting in the opposite corner. It was only now that he was closer that Alex could see the arrogance and the cruelty of the man he was about to face. Sir Thorn had probably been training all his life and knew that this next fight was going to be over as soon as it began. But he didn't care. Presumably he was being paid and would cheerfully maim Alex, providing he got his check. He was already smiling, showing cracked lips, uneven teeth. His nose had been broken at some time, and it had set badly. It had set badly. He might have had the body of a world-class athlete, but he had the face of a freak. A plastic bottle of water was forced between Alex's lips, and he drank. It was horribly warm in the arena, and that would only sap his strength. He wondered how Sir Thorn had managed to continue for so long. Perhaps he was given some sort of drug. The military music was blasting out all around him. The fans were turning, and Alex clung to the rope, trying to work out some sort of strategy. Would it be easier just to take a dive the moment the fight began? If he allowed himself to be knocked out in the opening seconds, at least it would be over. There was a risk in that too. It would all depend how hard Sir Thorn hit him. He didn't want to wake up with a broken neck. Music stopped. The bell rang. The spectators fell silent. It was too late to work out any plan. The first round had begun, and he took a couple of steps forward. He could feel the eyes of the crowd boring into him, waiting for him to go down. Sir Thorn looked completely relaxed. He had taken out the standard stance with his body weight poised on the front foot. Basic defense in almost every martial art, but he barely looked interested. It occurred to Alex that if he had any chance at all in this fight, it would be in the opening seconds. Nobody in the arena could possibly know that he was first grade, Dan a black belt in karate. The fight was completely unfair. So Thorne had the advantages of size, weight, and experience. But Alex had the advantage of surprise. He decided to use it. He continued forwards, and at the last second, when he knew he was close enough, he suddenly twisted around and lashed out with all his strength. He had used the back kick, one of the most powerful blows in karate. As if he had made contact, he would have taken his opponent out then, but to his dismay, his foot hit only empty air. So Thorne had reacted with fantastic speed, springing back and twisting so that the kick missed his abdomen by a centimetre. The audience gasped, then shouted with new excitement. I tried for a jab, but this time Thorne was ready. He blocked the attack with his right arm, then followed through with the counter kick that slammed into Alex's side, propelling him against the ropes. Alex was bruised and winded. Red spots danced in front of his eyes. If Thorne hit him a second time, it would be over. Alex rested him with the ropes against his shoulder and waited for the end. It didn't come. Thorne was smiling again, enjoying himself. The 14 boy hadn't been the easy kill that everyone expected, and he knew he could enjoy himself here. The audience wanted blood. They wanted drama too. He could play with the boy for a while, weaken him before the final blow that would put him in hospital. He reached out with his hand, bending his finger as if to say, "Come on." The crowd roared with approval. Even the gamblers who had already lost and were tearing up their yellow slips wanted to see more. Alex drew a deep breath and straightened up. But there was a red mark where Thorne's foot had caught him just above the waist. The man had a soul that could have been made of the toughest leather and leg muscles, like steel rods. How could Ash had got him into this? But Alex knew it. It wasn't his godfather's fault. He should have listened to Jack when he was in Sydney, when now he could have been safely back at school. For the next couple of minutes, the two of them circled each other, throwing a few feints, but neither landing a real punch. Alex tried to keep his distance while he recovered his breath. How long did each round last? He had seen that there were intervals, and he desperately needed a few seconds on his own. Unthreatened, time to think. The sweat was dripping off him. He wiped his eyes, and that was when Thorne attacked. A whirl of jabbing elbows, knees and fists, any one which could have knocked Alex down. In the next 30 seconds, Alex used every defense technique he had ever been taught, but he knew that, in truth, he was simply relying on his instinct, dodging and weaving as the arena seemed to spin around him. The audience shouting, the fans turning, and the sluggish heat weighing down on him from all sides. A right hook caught him on the side of his face, and his whole head jerked round. A spasm of pain travelled down his neck and spine. Thorne followed through with a side knee to the ribs. Alex doubled up, unable to help himself. He hit the canvas just as the bell rang for the end of the first round. There was applause and cheering. The music blared out, so Thorne leapt back, grinning and waving, enjoying the fight. Alex felt he had no strength left. He was aware of the two men acting as his seconds shouting at him, gesturing for him to return to his corner. So he had forced himself to his feet. His nose was bleeding. He could taste the blood as it trickled into his mouth. He wasn't going to last another round. That much was obvious. All the odds were against him, but he had come to a decision. So Thorne was older, taller, heavier, and more experienced than he was. There's the only way Alex was going to beat him. He was just going to have to cheat. One of the men who had chosen to look after Alex while he was fighting wiped away the blood with a wet sponge. The other helped him drink. Alex felt the cold water trickle down the sides of his face and over his shoulders. But both men were grinning at him, muttering words of encouragement as if he could understand a single word they were saying. They'd probably done the exact same during the previous fight, and Alex could have seen the result. Well, he was going to let them happen to him. These purple people were in for a surprise. He felt the bottle of water being forced one last time between his lips and sucked in as much as he could. A moment later, a bell rang and the bottle whistle was whisked away. The interval music stopped. There were shouts from different parts of the audience. Glancing towards the side, Alex saw Anand Sukit striding down to take place in the front row. Presumably, he wanted a closer view of the final knockout. Alex moved forward, cautiously, wrist raised, weight even distributed on the balls of his feet. So Thorn was waiting for him. That was good. The one thing that Alex had most feared was fast, direct attack. That wouldn't leave him time for what he had in mind. But Alex had shown his true colours in the first round. So Thorn knew that he had trained in at least one martial art, and he was planning his moves carefully. Alex has come close to knocking him out. Sathorn wasn't going to give him a second chance. In the end, Sathorn went for a straight clinch, the wrestling grip that, in Muay Thai, is also known as the standard tie-up. Suddenly they were face to face, their feet almost touching. Sathorn had locked his hands behind Alex's head, and he was sneering underconfidently. With extra height, he had complete advantage. He could throw Alex off balance or finish him with an explosive streak from the knee. He saw that the last seconds of the fight had arrived and roared their approval. He was exactly what Alex had wanted. It was exactly what he had been fighting. Before Sathorn could make his move, he acted. What nobody knew, nor Sathorn, nor seconds, nor the audience, was that Alex's mouth was still full of water, and had been since the round began. Now he spat it out straight into Sathorn's face. Sathorn reacted instinctively, jerking his head back in surprise and loosening his grip. For a second, he was blinded. Alex acted instantly, striking out with a savage uppercut that sent his fist crashing up into his opponent's jaw. That wasn't enough. He wasn't going to get a second chance. He had to finish this now. Alex swung round, putting all his strength into a single powerhouse kick, his barefoot landing square into the man's solar plexus. Even Sathorn's advantage muscle stretcher wasn't up to such a blow. Alex had the breath explode from his lips. All the colour left his face. For a moment, he stood there, hands hanging limply beneath him. The crowd had fallen silent as if in shock. Then Sathorn collapsed onto his knees and finally slammed face down, unconscious, on the canvas. The entire arena erupted with cries of anger and outrage. The audience had seen what had happened and they couldn't believe it. Before Gene Boy had been brought here to entertain them, but he had cheated them instead. They had lost money and their champion Sathorn had been humiliated. It was only now hearing the shouting all around him that Alex realized he had put himself into fresh danger. If he had played his part as expected, he might have been carried out on his back with a broken nose or worse. But presumably there would have been a consolation prize. He would have been driven home with the false documents that Alex had sent him here to collect. There's no longer any chance of that. He had offended the Snakehead, taken out their prize fighter. Somehow he doubted they were going to thank him and give him a gold cup. He stepped over the unconscious body and made as if to climb out of the ring. But he saw at once that he was right. And now Sukit was back on his feet. His face was dark with fury, his eyes ablaze. He had pulled a gun out of an inside pocket of his suit. Unbelievingly, Alex watched as he brought it around and aimed. Sukit was going to shoot him, right there in front of all these people, a punishment for the trick that had been played. There was nothing Alex could do, nowhere to hide. He watched the cold eyes of the muzzle focused on his head. Then all the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. It seemed to fold in from all sides like a collapsing box. Sukit had chosen that moment to fire, and he saw two bursts of orange flame and heard the shots. But he was already moving. The bullets had been aimed at his heart, at his head, but he had dropped down on the canvas and was rolling away, searching for the ropes on the other side of the ring. He found them, reaching up with one hand. He swung himself through, then down into the ringside area below. The spectators had reacted to the blacker with silence. The sound of the two shots had provoked instant panic. They were suddenly blinded and someone had a gun. Ice heard screams, the clatter of seats being pushed to the ground, Someone ran into him, then tumbled back. There were more cries of protest. Alex crouched where he was, waiting for his eyes to get used to the dark. At least that happened quickly. As Alex had approached the building from the river, he had seen how dilapidated it was, and although there were a few windows, the roof and the walls were full of cracks. The moon was still shining, and the light was filling in everywhere. Not enough to distinguish faces, but Alex was in no mood to make new friends. All he wanted was the way out, and he could see it straight in front of him, up a flight of concrete steps. He got to his feet and ran, immediately crashing into the wire fence that surrounded the ring. Where was the opening? Desperately, he felt his way along, using his palms against the wire. He found the gap and stumbled through. Forcing himself on towards the ragged seating, where he climbed steeply up to the door where he had come in. There was a third shot, and the man standing next to him twisted around it and fell. Snakehead had spotted him, which was hardly surprising. Alex's bare shoulders and brightly coloured shorts made him a target, even in the dark. He scrambled on, fighting his way through the crowd. His skin was slippery and covered in sweat, and at least that made it difficult for anyone to grab hold of him. The man stepped in front of him, muttering something in his own language, and raised a hand, driving the heel straight in towards his face. The man grunted and fell backwards. The knife he had been holding clattered to the floor. Now Alex understood the rules. He was to be captured and killed. That seemed to be the price of the winning fight. Alex was unarmed. He was half naked, and members of the Snakehead were all around him. He knew that only speed and the darkness were on his side, and he had to find his way out of the building in the next 3 minutes, and that meant retrieving his own clothes first. He reached the door, and it was when the lights flashed back on. Sugar saw him at once. He pointed with a stubby finger and shouted. Alex saw half a dozen young men running towards him. All of them black-haired, dressed in black shirts, were all coming at him from both sides. Snakehead fired. The bullet hit a pillar and ricocheted into one of the television sets. The glass shattered, and there was a crackle of electricity. Alex saw a tongue of flame. He wondered if the whole place might catch light. That would help him, but the walls were too damp. The river was everywhere, even in the air. He was breathing. He hurled himself in through the doorway and down the wooden staircase on the other side, almost losing his balance on the crazy foreground steps. A splinter buried itself into his toe. Alex ignored the pain. He was back in the corridor. Which way had they led him, left or right? He had less than a second to make a decision, and the wrong choice might kill him. He went right. That way. The corridor sloped upward, and he remembered that coming in, he had gone down. Behind him he had heard a burst of gunfire. Not one gun, but several. That was strange. He's out of sight, so who were they firing at? The dull yellow light bulbs flickered overhead. It seemed that a war had broken out in the arena. Was it possible? Alex wondered if Ash could have somehow followed him here. Suddenly, there seemed to be someone on his side. He found the room where he had undressed and ran in, swinging. The door was shut behind him. His clothes were where he'd left them, and gratefully he pulled them on. And at least he looked normal again, and he needed the trainers. If he was going to run over 8 more wooden floors. When he was dressed, he went back to the door and slowly opened it. Sweat trickled down his face. His hair was drenched. There didn't seem to be anyone outside. The end of the corridor and the exit to the jetty was about 20 metres away, but as he made his way to the walls of the open air, Alex heard the roar of an engine and knew that a boat had just pulled it in. He guessed what was going to happen next. Luckily, he was outside one of the other rooms. He threw himself inside just as the main door crashed open and new arrivals began their way. down the corridor. There were two of them. They were both carrying old-fashioned Russian-made RPK-74 light machine guns. The barrels had been modified to make them shorter. As Alex crouched in the shadows, he heard them move towards him. They were searching the changing rooms one by one. In less than a minute, they would be here. Alex looked around him. The room was almost identical to the one he had left, with no cupboards, nowhere to hide, and a single window securely barred. There was one different. Part of the floor had rotted away. You could just make out the water churning underneath. Could he fit through? There was a crash of storage room next to his. Was the door unopened. He heard one of the men call out in time. They would be here in a few seconds. I decided to think what he might be getting himself into. The water was a long way down, and the current might suck him beneath the surface. But if he stayed here, he would die anyway. He went over the hole, took a deep breath, and dropped through it. He fell into darkness. Just had time to put a hand over his nose before he hit the river. The water was warm and sluggish, covered by a layer of filth and rotting vegetation. The sting was almost unendurable. It was like plunging into the oldest, dirty spot in the world. As Alex broke back through the surface, he could feel the liquid like oil running down his cheeks and over his lips. Some sort of slime was clinging to his face. He tore it off, forcing himself not to swallow. He was out of the arena, but he still hadn't escaped. He could hear voices above him. It was almost impossible to see anything. He was underneath the building, treading water, surrounded by the concrete pillars that held the place up. In the distance, he could make out the shape of the boat that must have brought the two men with machine guns. It was alongside the jetty, his engine still running. There was a stamp of footsteps, and he looked up as two flickering shadows passed over his head. They belonged to men running across the veranda outside the arena. Sigurd must have given the order to surround the place. Presumably they were still searching it by inch. Then something climbed onto his shoulder. So now that he remembered the movement he had seen when he arrived. Something living in the water and the shadows beneath the building. Alex reached out and grabbed one of those pillars, steadying himself. Then very slowly he turned his head. It was a rat, heavy and bloated, over 30 centimeters long, with vicious yellow teeth and eyes the colour of blood. Its tail curling round behind Alex's neck, adding another 25 centimeters to its length, and it was clinging to his shirt with little claws, scrabbling very feverishly at the material. And it wasn't alone. As Alex froze in utter horror, two more rats appeared, then a fourth. Soon the water was swarming with them. Another one climbed on the side of his face, scratching the skin as he pulled himself on top of his head. Alex wanted to scream, but it was the one thing he couldn't do. There were armed men standing above him, only a few meters away. If he so much as splashed too loudly, it would all be over. Was the rat going to bite him? Another terrible thought. Was he going to be eaten alive? He felt something nudge his shirt. One of the creatures dived underwater and was trying to dig his way inside. He could feel its nose and claws burrowing against the soft flesh of his stomach. With a feeling of nausea, he reached down and gently pushed it away. If he was too rough, the rat would bite him, and once the others got a scent of his blood, he stopped himself. Better not to imagine. His only hope was to do something. Let the rat decide that he was just another bit of pollution that had been dumped from the river. He tried to send his thoughts out to the pack. I'm not edible. You wouldn't like me. The rat that had climbed onto his head was now nestling in his hair. Alice winced as it pulled out a few strands and began to chew on them, taking out the taste. The first rat, the one that had started all this, was still on his shoulder. Without moving, Alex glanced down and saw a pointed nose twitching right beside his jugular. Behind it, he could make out two eyes gleam with excitement, fascinated by the rapid pulsing. They struck time with Alex's heart. All I had to do was bite through the flesh, find the vein. Alex was certain he was about to strike. He was saved by an explosion. A fire erupted in the base end of the building, reflecting down into the water. At once, all the rats took fright, leaping off him and disappearing behind the pillars. What the hell was going on? Had you perhaps wandered into some war between two rival snakeheads? That didn't matter now. He had to move before the rats come back. Alex launched himself away from the pillar and swam through the muck, trying to keep his face out of the water. The arena was on fire. He could hear voices yelling and saw the flicker of red. piece of blazing wood tumbled out of nowhere and fell, hissing and spitting into the river. Alex glanced upwards. The building had been rickety. The building had been rickety to begin with. He didn't want it collapsing now, nor when he was underneath. The jetty was straight ahead of him. Even if the men were standing on guard, I doubt he would be noticed. With all that was going on inside, nobody would be looking down into the water anyway. He didn't care any more. He'd had enough of this. It was time to go. He reached the side of the boat. A sheer metal wall rising up into fresh air and freedom. There was a net hanging over the side, and Alex grabbed it gratefully. Somehow he found the last reserves of strength he needed to climb up. The boat was one of the old river ferries with a red roof to show that it crossed continually from one side to the other. There was one man on board, presumably the driver, a guy wearing jeans and a jacket, with no shirt. He was leaning against the side, watching the fire with astonishment. The wooden building was crackling loudly. Flames had caught hold of the roof and the back wall, and was leaping up into the night sky. The wood was splintering, pieces of it splashing down. Alex didn't even try to be quiet. He ordered himself over the rail over the side of the ferry. Behind the driver, the man didn't turn round. Alex ran across the deck and grabbed him by his collar and belt. He was lucky. The man weighed very little. Alex heaved him up over the rail and into the river. Then, still dripping wet, water running into his eyes, he went over to the controls and slammed the throttle down as far as it would go. This was going to be his way out of him. Once he was down river, nobody would be able to find him. The engines roared and the propellers thrashed at the water, turning it white. But the boat surged forward. Alex grinned, but a second later, he was almost thrown off his feet as the boat seemed to slam into a brick wall. Still gripping the steering wheel, he turned around and saw to his dismay that the boat had been moored to one of the pillars supporting the building. The pillars were churning up the water. If the racks were anywhere near, they would be chopped to pieces. But the boat wasn't going anywhere, and the rope, almost as thick as Alex's arm, stretched between the stern and the pillar. I didn't have time to untie it. Alex eased the throttle back, afraid the engines would explode, and the rope staggered. And the rope sagged. Then somebody shouted something. With a heavy heart, he saw Anand Sukit appeared out on the walkway outside the arena, anger stretching his mouth even further across his hideous face. He had seen Alex. He still had his gun. Once again he took his aim. It was about 20 meters away, but he had a clear shot. Alex did the only thing he could. Once again he slammed down the throttle, and suddenly it seemed to him that everything happened at once. There were 3 shots, but Alex wasn't hit, and it wasn't Sukit who had fired. The Snakehead lieutenant seemed to throw his own gun into the river, as if he no longer had any use for it. Then he followed it, pitching head first into the water. He had been shot from behind, the bullets hitting him between the shoulder. He thought he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, but before he could make out who he was, the boat surged forward again, and this time it took a pillar with it, ripping it out from beneath the burning building. Alex felt himself propelled into the middle of the river incredibly fast. He risked a last look back and saw the arena consumed by fire, sparks dancing above it. In the distance he could hear fire engines, but they weren't going to be needed. He had torn out a vital part of the structure. Even as he watched, the entire building slumped to its knees as if in surrender, then slid off the bank and into the river. All of it went. The water rushed in through the rotting wood, eager at last to reclaim it. Alex heard screams coming from the inside. Another burst of gunfire, and then the Chatter Trading Company had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Only the green sign remained, floating on the surface, surrounded by other pieces of splintered wood and debris. The flames sat briefly on the river before extinguishing themselves. Dozens of shadowy figures thrashed and shouted in the water, trying to reach dry land. Alex staggered at the steering wheel and brought the ferry under control. He was incredible, but he really was the only person on board. So which way now? North would take him to a familiar territory. He could see a Peninsula Hotel in the far distance. He wondered what he must look like. Bruised, scrapped, soaked in rags. He didn't think they'd be too happy to let him check in. Anyway, there was still Ash, presumably waiting for him in Chinatown. Alex steered the ferry towards the next public jetty. They would have to do without the forged papers. He just hoped Alex would understand. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you for listening to that.